I've worked at the homeless shelter in my town for about 7 years. In 7 years, I've done just about everything there. Cooked the food, cleaned the toilets, set up and run the AA meetings, done the little security work. Hell, I've been a glorified babysitter more nights than I can count. In all that time, though, I've come to care for the people who wander in, looking for a dry place to sleep and a warm bed for the night. I know everyone who works night shifts says this, but the night shifts at the shelter really are different from day shift. The day shift has no less than 6 staff in the kitchen. That's helpers and a chef, though he's less of a 5-star chef and more of a Waffle House fry cook. They've got 5 therapists and a doctor, as well as 3 nurses in the medical facility, and 6 staff members who do everything from answer the phones to clean the toilets. During the day, this place is more like a Howard Johnson than a shelter, but at night, it's more like a youth hostel. The night shift has 5 employees, a cook and a kitchen helper, both of whom are gone by 10, a nurse, who mostly tries to keep everything stable until morning, and 2 staffers who keep the place from falling apart. I am one of the latter. It's a strange way to do things, I know, but management figures that, at night, the residents should be sleeping, and thus need less care. In all the time I've been here, I've broken up many fights, held a lot of hands while people were puking their guts out, waited on ambulances while someone had a seizure or went into convulsions, and herded scared residents into the hallway while someone went through a violent DT spell or ripped the dorm apart. I've also seen a small group of residents put on a production of A Christmas Story, seen them exchange gifts under a tree on Christmas Day, throw a regular resident a surprise birthday party, and help each other through loss and pain. The homeless community is a lot more tight-knit than anyone would ever believe, and despite its many problems, I've never had an incident like I did the night in question. That was the night that all hell broke loose. It happened about 3 weeks ago, December 18th, and I had just walked in out of a nasty blizzard. The weather is never what you'd call good, but today's weather was a killer. I crunched in a little before 6 and said hi to Janice, who was at the front desk that night. She looked up from her Candy Crush long enough to give me a half-hearted wave, which I returned before heading to the cafeteria. Dinner service was just starting, so I put on an apron and helped out. Chad, the shelter cook, doesn't like non-kitchen staff in the kitchen area, so I bypassed the back and took a spot on the line, where I passed out bowls of soup and grilled cheese sandwiches. I greeted some familiar faces, talked to some people I knew for a few minutes, and scanned the room for my regulars. There are many faces you know in a shelter, and those were the faces that I was looking for. I saw Lou and Chuck sitting around a table that was packed with other drifters. Chuck was telling a long and excited story to a crowd of homeless and stopped long enough to wave at me when he saw I was looking at him. Lou waved too, smiling, and Chuck went back to telling his story. While Lou was a classic example of a city vagrant, Chuck was what you'd call a traveler. He'd been here a few months, said he liked the architecture of our town, but before that, he claimed he'd been most everywhere. I've picked oranges in Florida for 50 cents a crate. I've brought in Idaho spuds for $2 a bag. I've worked in greasy spoon diners and driven cabs in New York City. And I'm here to tell you, girl, that I've seen just about everything this great nation has to offer. Probably saved a bundle, seeing as I saw it on my own 2 pins, too, he said as he slapped his leg and chuckled. He and Lou had palled around for a while, and I like to see someone looking out for Lou. As a recovering heroin addict, he doesn't always remember things so well, and if someone like Chuck or Lenny were looking out for him, he'd be less likely to stumble into traffic or hunt for a needle again. As though summoned by the thought of his name, Lenny came stomping up right about then and gave me his trademark Lenny smile, which showcased all 5 of his teeth. "Evening, Miss Liz. How's your night going so far?" I didn't immediately respond, though. Someone in the back had caught my eye. He looked like a mall Santa who had come wandering in for a bite before his shift, and it was certainly the right time of year for him. He wore a dark red cap, had a long white beard that hung to his waist, and was dressed in an old red ski jacket, topped off with a pair of scuffed black motorcycle boots. He sat in the back and ate his meal, and I could see the end of a gnarled wooden stick leaning against the wall with an easy reach. He had a big old stained traveling sack perched on it, and it only enhanced the idea that he was some kind of Santa Claus. Lenny looked back to where I was looking for a minute before trying to bring me back to reality. "You know that old man, Miss Liz?" he asked, genuinely curious. I shook my head. "No, Lenny, I don't think I've ever seen him before. Have you?" Lenny shook his head in a slow, deliberate way. "No, ma'am. I guess he must be from out of town, like Chuck," he said as he pointed to old Chuck, who was miming a fishing net that was full, it seemed, as he yanked it out of somewhere. I gave Lenny his food and made small talk. He responded with his usual sermon. He had woken up, got dressed, and he and Lou had gone down to Panhandle on their favorite corner. They had left before noon, since that's when the cops usually came around. They'd eaten their lunch at the shelter, then spent the afternoon looking for cans and bottles to recycle. Each of these pronouncements contained a "by Jesus" or "by the grace of God, amen," and Lenny was a firm believer in the power of God, and believed that his mercy was the reason he was still alive today. A staunch atheist I may be, but I wasn't about to dampen his spirits. I gave him an extra grilled cheese, and he went over to sit with his friends. After dinner service, most of the residents went to the activity room to watch TV, or hung out in the dining hall to talk. I took this opportunity to visit one of my friends in the medical bay before it was time to call lights out. The medical door sits right across from the welcome desk, where Janice was still on her phone as she had been earlier. I ducked in and received a nod from Miss Casterly, our resident night nurse, and I said hello to some of my other residents that were in here. Miss Casterly and I have a lot in common, at least in my mind. She's a retired school nurse with 5 years of nursing school before discovering her passion for teaching. Her job is to put band-aids on it and keep it from getting out of control until the doctor gets here in the morning. In many ways, I have much the same responsibility. I've always seen us as soldiers in the same war, and I think she senses that when we talk. John was in the back. His legs were still wrapped up, and he was covered in quite a few blankets, as the IV dripped him full of warmth. John was one of the residents I had hoped to get off the streets, and before his accident, I thought I had succeeded. He'd been an engineer before his wife left him, and his depression had caused him to slip into a dangerous spiral that had ultimately landed him on the streets. When I found out about his background, I had started trying to help him find a job so he could get back on his feet. When a local factory needed a machinist, John had agreed to give it a try. Then, 2 weeks ago, he'd gone and dropped off the face of the earth. I'd almost given up on finding him again when the hospital called me a few days ago. He'd given them my name just before they were going to kick him out, and I helped him get back to the shelter so he could recover. It turned out he and 5 other homeless guys had been caught out in the blizzard and nearly froze to death under the East Side overpass. His legs had been frostbitten pretty good, but thanks to the hospital, he was recovering nicely, and thanks to the shelter, he'd be able to finish recovering without being turned back out into the blistering cold. He greeted me, and we talked for a few minutes about nothing in particular. I asked him about his recovery, and he said he thought he'd be better in a few days. He asked me if I'd heard from the factory about the job, and I told him they had been understanding once I explained his situation. They had asked me to get in touch with him after John was feeling better, and I told them we certainly would. John thanked me for working so hard for him, and after a little more small talk, I excused myself to go check on the dorms. Had I stayed any longer, I likely wouldn't be alive to tell this story. I had left medical and was going into the dorm area when I heard the front doors open. I felt a blast of cold air run across my back, and I turned to see who'd come in out of the chill. I felt myself stiffen, however, as I saw them. 3 men in overcoats with huge scarves covering their mouths. I couldn't have told you why at the time, but they just struck me as wrong. Their posture made me think of something not quite human, that crouched way of standing that you sometimes see in primates. The way they held their heads made me think their faces were oddly elongated too. They hadn't seen me yet, and their attention was focused on Janice as she rose to greet them. She got up and walked towards them, asking them to sign in and brandishing a clipboard at them. That was when one of them reached out and broke her neck. Now, I don't mean that they used ESP or telekinesis or anything. When I say they reached out and broke her neck, what I mean is that his hand moved so fast that I couldn't even see it. Janice fell with her head twisted all the way around, and I was left gazing in a stupor. She hadn't moved. He hadn't moved, except for his hand, and she suddenly went from being alive to being dead in the space of 2 seconds. As her body crumpled to the floor, her killer made a muffled sound like a cat yowling and ripped the scarf off his face. Underneath, its face was the no color of static, and its skin seemed to crawl like an army of dead white ants. His face opened and his mouth elongated like a snake dislocating its jaw as it fell on her and started tearing her clothes off. It ripped them open, like you or I might tear the wrapper off a candy bar, and it bent its face down as it bit into her. It pulled and tore chunks of meat away with hungry, feral bites. And it didn't chew the meat so much as the meat dissolved when it came in contact with his skin. I know that's a lot to process, and I know it sounds like it might take a while, but this whole exchange happened in less than a minute from beginning to end. 1 minute, Janice was getting up to ask the strangers to sign in, and a minute later, she was being chewed on like an animal in a National Geographic film, while I stood there frozen to the spot. I know that makes me sound like a coward, but I couldn't help it. The scene before me was so alien, so shocking, that my mind almost couldn't process it. As the killer hunched, eating, its friends turned and headed into the medical area. Miss Chasterley said something as they came in, but it was drowned out as the whole room erupted into shouts of terror, mixed with breaking furniture and alien yowls. Then, the thing looked up, noticing me for the first time, and the sight of this strange face and its sewing needle teeth moved me to action. I turned and ran through the double doors that led to the dorm and slammed them shut behind me. I slammed my fist onto the big red button on the wall and sighed as the mag locks engaged behind me. The state required us to install them on the doors to the medical and the dormitory area, which led to the back office. Since both areas contained confidential files, we had to have a way to secure them. And what better way than magnetic locks that exert 1,000 pounds of pressure? I put my back against the door, knowing that these things couldn't get in through that, and we'd be safe until they left or the police arrived. Knowing this, I still screeched when it hit the door hard enough to rattle it in the frame. The residents started coming out then, and the corridor was soon filled with the sounds of running feet and raised voices. Before I knew it, I had 20 or so upset people behind me. When Lenny put a hand on my shoulder, I jumped to the ceiling. His face was ashen, and I could tell that he'd caught a glimpse of the hallway behind me. He opened his mouth, probably to ask what was going on, when an inhuman scream pierced the hallway, and something hit the glass on the door hard enough to send cracks running through it. That worried me more than a little, because that glass is supposed to stop a bullet. The first bullet, at least. This thing had just cracked it with a single hit. The second hit bulged it grotesquely inward, and the third turned it into a square of broken glass and twisted metal rebar. An arm stretched through and began hunting for a latch then. "Lisa, get back!" someone yelled, and I saw Chuck run forward with a fire extinguisher in hand. He slammed the butt of the canister into the arm, but it did no more damage than the shards of glass had. The arm continued to rake around, searching for some way inside, and when Chuck brought the canister down for the third time, it finally seemed to register. It swiped out with those long nails, and the canister parted easily, spraying clouds of foam into the air. Chuck let it go and threw the sputtering thing at the arm, backtracking as he moved towards the group. He turned to me then, and I suddenly realized they were all looking at me, looking for me to guide them out of this situation. I almost laughed at them. What part of this did they think was in the Homeless Shelter Management Handbook? There was no protocol for being set upon by a group of monsters who ignored the laws of nature and did whatever they wanted. They wanted me to help them, but I doubted that anyone could help them. We weren't people to these things. We were just troublesome food bits stuck at the bottom of a can. We were trapped in here, and it was only a matter of time before they knocked down the door, maglocks or not, and turned this hallway into a slaughterhouse. I fell to my knees, wanting to bring them up to my chest, and my body longed to drop to the floor so I could spend my last few minutes hugging myself in terror before the end. I had started to do just that when the sound of a walking stick brought me back to reality. The man who looked like Santa Claus came out of the dormitory and smiled at me in a decidedly up the chimney he goes kind of way. He said not a word, but went straight to his work, and as the creature's hand scampered about like a long-nailed spider, he drew close and stopped just out of arm's reach. The owner of the hand stopped reaching, and I heard a wet noise that sounded like the worst head cold in history. The thing sniffed at the air like a man sucking up soup, and it said something that I'll never forget. I had to look it up afterwards when I was in my right mind again, but it uttered a single muddy word before trying to pull its hand away. It said Sacerdos and tried desperately to get its hand out of the hole. The old man shot his hand out, quick as a snake, and gripped the wrist in a single gnarled old hand. The creature squealed, the scream too high to be called a scream, really, and the corridor was filled with a pulse of white light. Then it dimmed, and I saw the arm no longer attached to the creature. It disintegrated before our eyes into something like oatmeal and sawdust. The creature went crazy then. Its screams were full of terrible fury as it slammed its misshapen face into the little window and gnashed its two big teeth at the little man. He snapped a finger out then and booped the grotesque thing on its flat nose. In another bright flash, the creature was gone, little more than a greasy cloud in the space of the little window. Through the hole in the door, I could see the other two lumbering out into the hallway, streaked with gore and not even trying to hide their strangeness. I looked over at the little man standing placidly by the door. Some black substance had splashed onto his coat, but he didn't seem to notice. I started getting nervous around him the longer he stood there. The hellish creatures were trapped outside the room, but how dangerous was this seemingly harmless old man who'd reduced one of them to nothing with a flash of light? When you work with the homeless for long enough, you start to question things like miracles or even the concept of change itself. This old man had just done something that I couldn't explain, and he felt like a piece in a game I didn't understand. A piece that was counter to the things outside, I hoped. "Miss, I want you to release the door and let me out into the hallway," he finally said. I gaped at him. "Sir, those things will kill you. I've already watched them kill at least one person tonight, and I'm not in a big hurry to watch them tear you apart, too." He smiled at me in that Santa Claus way of his. "Oh, I don't think so." I had wondered what brought me here tonight. It appears that the powers that be knew that this was where I needed to be the most. I started to argue with him, but something in his eyes told me that he was going out there, whether I wanted him to or not. I pushed the button, and the door opened. He walked out and said the last thing I ever heard him say. "You won't want to watch this." He strode towards the pair of them as I re-engaged the lock. Suddenly, my eyes were assaulted by a bright flash of light like nothing I had ever seen. I fell behind the door, shutting my stinging eyes, and I could hear other residents yelling in similar pain. The creatures screamed in agony, and under that din, I could hear a sound like sizzling bacon as the old man went about his butcher's work. The whole thing lasted less than a minute, but it was a whole 10 minutes before I could see through my watering eyes. Standing shakily, I looked through the window hole and saw that nothing but the empty hallway remained. No blood, no bodies except for Janice's, and no evidence that any of them had been there at all. I called the police and Mrs. Stone, who's responsible for the interests of the benefactors. The police arrived first. The ambulance they brought with them was a welcome sight. Janice was pronounced dead at the scene, along with 10 others in the medical bay, Miss Chasterley among them. The medics said that it looked like a wild animal had attacked them, and big pieces of flesh had been torn out of them, along with some of their softer parts. The worst was their eyes, which had simply been devoured by whatever had attacked them. And no one was left alive to tell the police anything. The residents and I told them about the 3 men, omitting the old man, but the officers didn't seem to believe that a monster had attacked us. They said it was likely a group of mentally unstable residents with masks that had maybe had a personal grudge against the shelter. and that out of shock, we had concocted the rest. Miss Stone arrived then, and I had to tell the story again, but I don't think she believed me either. I was given 2 weeks paid time off while the shelter was repaired, but I'll have to think long and hard about whether I want to return. The idea that this might happen again, has likely happened before, chills me to the bone and makes me question everything I've ever believed in. Who was that old man? Was he an angel? A messenger from God? A creature from space? What does that make those things that attacked us? I've spent the last 3 nights trying to find forgetfulness in the bottom of a whiskey bottle. Every time I close my eyes, though, I can still see those things. I probably always will. I'm sharing this so maybe less equipped shelter workers will read it, and it might help them should this happen to them. They come at night, and they attack your wounded first. They kill without remorse. If I'd seen them on the street, I would have thought they were just normal people. But their coats hide monsters like nothing you'd ever expect. If it happens to you, then I wish you luck. If they find you, then I just hope the old man found you first. Good evening, my little creeperonis. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's reading. If you'd like to support the show, we have a Patreon. I'll leave a link below. Contributors at our $5 level, that's the spooky skeleton level, have their names read out at the end of every video, so you could be the first to have their name read out. And of course, you can always buy a book off of Amazon. There's also a link to that below. Or you can just keep coming back every week and supporting the channel. We sure do appreciate you coming by. And as always, this is Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.